So within 5 minutes, we will have around 20-25 people. As soon as 20-20 people are there online, we'll start the talk, sir.
Right.
ये योगेश, there are many windows open on my laptop.
सर आपका लैपटॉप पे सिर्फ आपको प्रेजेंटेशन दिखेगा सर का, दिख रहा है आपको स्क्रीन?
मेरे को दिख रहा है, प्रेजेंटेशन आ गया।
बस सर वही आपको दिखेगा अभी, पूरा टॉक, जितना पूरा टॉक है सर का प्रेजेंटेशन दिखेगा आपको।
हाँ, ये बाकी विंडोज बंद कर डालूं क्या मैं? गो टू वेबिनार एंड इधर वेब, क्या वो सब बंद कर डालता हूँ? मिनिमाइज कर देता हूँ।
हाँ सर। So sir, our second panelist today is Dr. Rajvilas Narkhede. He is a surgical gastroenterologist at Alexis Hospital. He has also joined us. Rajvilas, welcome.
Hi sir. Hi Yogesh. Good evening.
Good evening.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening. Good evening, Rajvilas.
So Sudhir sir and Rajvilas, when the talk is going on, that time I'll switch off our all webcams. Only Savji sir will be visible to everyone.
Sure.
Okay.
And once the talk is started, I'll also mute our everyone's mic so that there is no secondary disturbance from any of the place.
Yeah.
So we will be listening to only Savji sir. We will be seeing only him. As soon as the talk is finished, I'll open up your mics. Then we start the discussion and all.
Okay.
Sure.
Right, sir? So just like we have right now around 15 people. It's 8:02. We'll wait for 2-3 minutes and then we'll start, sir. So it's a very simple thing, sir. वो पहले लगता है, but it gets attached in a very quick time. Just 1-2 minute में लग जाता है, and it runs very smoothly with internet. No issues with internet. So around 15 people.
Students कितने हैं?
Sorry sir.
PG students.
Sir PG students exactly अभी इसमें कितने हैं? I can't see that क्योंकि सबके नाम ही दिख रहे हैं. I don't know who are.
Okay. I am audible to everyone right now.
I can see Kane sir is there. I can see Ghanshyam Chude sir, Nagdive sir. Start with your introduction to the topic and speaker, and then we'll go ahead with the talk.
Yeah.
Tome sir.
Hello. Hi. Hello. Good evening, everybody. Yeah. Should I start?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
So today, Dr. Rajendra Savji is going to discuss surgeon's role in the management of extrahepatic portal hypertension. As all of you know, portal hypertension still continues to be debated very widely in India. And the reason being that, unlike Western population, we still have about 30 to 40% of portal hypertension, which is extrahepatic in nature. And the last word in portal hypertension surgery is yet to be written. And since we have such a major load of extrahepatic portal hypertension, surgery continues to play a very important role in this scenario. Dr. Rajendra Savji, a renowned pediatric surgeon, has been dealing with portal hypertension since last 30 years or so. And I would now request Dr. Savji to start his talk.
Yes, thank you, Sudhir, for that kind introduction. Good evening to everyone. It's very nice after the idyllic daytime to have great time on webinar to interact with colleagues, teachers, and friends. A very warm welcome to this webinar. First of all, I would like to make a little change in the heading of the topic, in the sense it's my mistake, in fact, when I gave this topic, when Yogesh asked me. It is where the talk is going to be on portal hypertension surgery role, where liver function is not progressively getting damaged. Okay, it means I'll be covering pre-sinusoidal portal hypertension along with extrahepatic portal venous obstruction. So that will be my topic today. I have decided to speak on number of points here, which probably will cover reasonably well for the likes of everyone who are there. I know there are different learning curve people who will be attending, but I have to manage it, and I'll be very happy to answer all the question if I have missed, or deliberately I have missed, left some points over there. So it will be the introduction, portal circulation in its applied aspects. I'll spend little more time on this applied anatomy. Causes, pathophysiology and natural history of extrahepatic portal hypertension. There is a lot of misconception as far as natural history of extrahepatic portal hypertension is concerned. Then brushing up some investigations and some important issues there. Then approach to a case of portal hypertension in certain special situations in the form of case scenarios. I thought if the time permits and everybody would like to sort of participate as a case scenario, then management focus will be exclusively on surgical interventions. So I'll be just sweeping all pharmacotherapy, endotherapy, and tips and all those treatment. And finally, it will be a take-home message. We remain very curious when we enter onto our clinical side, and then when we hear about portal hypertension, the heroism, the frustrations of a unit which does that type of surgery usually carries a pride badge. And when we settle down into our clinical posting, when we come out of the final MBBS, enter into the residency, we start realizing how much confusion is there. Because a lot of things, as you have already said as a panelist, that there is no final word, and it keeps on going on over the years. Then you enter into a real chaotic phase when exam comes, and you try to sort of appear and try to present such case. When you enter as a faculty, you are in a dilemma whether I should muster courage to discharge this case somehow by compulsion, or by sort of courage, you pick up this, and then you start realizing the complexities of this condition. And subsequently, by going through various sort of complex issues of this condition, and it usually takes a toll of around 20, 25, 30 years, which right now probably I am there. And then you probably link to a current scenario where again you are curious. So you start with a curiosity, and then again you are curious. So over the years, whatever little I have learned, I would like to share with our audience. With this little introductory background, surgeon's role always remained predominant till 1960s, almost for a century, when first portal hypertension surgery, what is known as ex fistula, was done somewhere in 1860s. So for over a century, surgeons were custodian of this entity, and with trials and tribulations, as the time passed, there were some enthusiastic period, and then there was some lull over a period of time, because of obviously what is cirrhosis was not known, what is extrahepatic portal hypertension means was not known. Only aim was to control bleeding, and naturally there was a lot of mortality, morbidity, frustrations, etc. As we reach to 1960s, a lot of technology, supportive care, etc., and everything in general has improved, and therefore with endoscopy, good pharmacotherapy, and TIPS procedure which came in, and therefore the surgeon's role, which was there in the emergency situation, has taken aback and taken over by these specialities. So therefore, there is a period of sort of feeling of sort of a negativity among surgeons that there is probably no role left for surgeons, but it is not like that. As Sudhir has already told, there is such a big burden of extrahepatic portal hypertension, which is usually idiopathic and usually due to non-prothrombotic states, as it is seen in the Western world. So we have got a lot of work to do. Only thing, we have to reorganize ourselves and reorient ourselves in a multidisciplinary team where a lot of people, gastroenterologists, hepatologists, interventional radiologists, and surgeons, and many other people would be participating, and you would be one of the part of the team, not as a sole custodian as used to be. So that is how that feeling is there. But I sort of foresee or anticipate that now, if we currently refer to one of the very important meetings which happened on portal hypertension in 2015-16 in Bavino in Italy. Every 3-4 years, there is taking a stock of this portal hypertension in different areas. Last consecutive 3-4 years, it was in Bavino, Italy. I happened to visit Italy about 6 months back and happened to meet that team. And after discussing and finding out their work as far as portal hypertension is concerned, it's a very gratifying thing and a very sort of interesting thing which I noted. Even when surgeon's role had come down, now surgeon's role is seen as a preemptive shunt surgery person, because the shunt, which is the most physiological shunt which has come up recently, what is known as mesoportal bypass or mesorex bypass or rex shunt, is been now ratified as a preemptive shunt to be carried out with specific and very strict guidelines, and that is how a very curious situation has happened. And I'm sure we are not fully aware, last word is not written. There are a lot of changes likely to occur. Therefore, we should continue with great enthusiasm as a surgeon. There is no doubt. Now coming to next few 3-4 slides will be on applied anatomy, as I have said. Everybody is aware of portal circulation, but I must bring to your notice that there are two types of portal circulations in our body. One is hepatic portal circulation, which we are going to focus today, and perhaps there is another link where possibly some missing link which is occurring might be connected in future. There is another portal circulation which is known as hypophyseal portal circulation, which connects hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary through the venous connections. Right now, there is debate whether extrahepatic portal hypertension on a long-term basis remains normal liver, but some people have recorded EEG changes and some neuropsychiatric or emotional changes, and therefore affecting central nervous system, and probably could lead to through such another portal system which is known as hypophyseal system. Coming to our hepatic portal system, which is quite extensive, as can be appreciated from here, and it includes all the alimentary tract above pectinate line, taking from gut, spleen, pancreas, and gallbladder, which are the part of the portal system, and three important major veins: splenic vein, inferior mesenteric vein, and superior mesenteric vein. These are the major part of portal venous circulation in the abdomen. The SV and SMV, they will form the portal vein, and then portal vein will enter into the liver. So this is a basic parameter. What I would like to focus your attention to this axis, what is known as splenoportal axis. This splenoportal axis, in the conditions today which I am going to talk about, one is portal vein obstruction, any thrombus or any congenital abnormality, cavernomatous malformation, extrinsic compression will form a sort of a block here, and the changes will occur. Then similar type of a situation, overall clinical situation as well as outcome will be there in intrahepatic pre-sinusoidal condition, which I'll come to it later in the causes. But there will be patency of splenoportal axis. In extrahepatic portal venous obstruction, there will not be patency of this system here. Nevertheless, management plan, outcomes, and etc. are pretty similar. What is important strictly defining extra hepatic portal venous obstruction is that even though entire portal system is included in this portal circulation, isolated splenic vein thrombosis or SMV thrombosis or any other vein thrombosis is not included strictly in the definition of extrahepatic portal vein thrombosis. These might be associated. Portal vein thrombosis may be associated with splenic vein or SMV or any other thrombosis. So that is a very important definition we must keep in our mind. As we know, there is systemic and portal collaterals which usually will remain dormant unless and until they are opened as a result of block or increased resistance here. And these collaterals which are common, which we all are aware, and the most important and the dreadful, which is here from the left gastric vein in right gastric vein, posterior gastric vein, which will be forming anastomosis with the intercostal, diaphragmatic, and azygous minor. So this is most dreadful because it will lead to unexpected exsanguinating bleeding, and therefore it is most important to us. Nevertheless, other collateral circulations are also equally important, like umbilical, either this one hemorrhoidal, which will be presenting as internal hemorrhoids, and then there will be splenic to diaphragm, then anterior abdominal wall, then all this structure in relation with the posterior abdominal wall. There are n numbers of named and unnamed collaterals which are there and which keep on decompressing portal circulation when happen. The applied importance which I feel like to highlight here, that when you plan to do surgery for portal hypertension with a large spleen, when you enter into abdomen as opposed to non-hypertensive portal hypertensive states, where you can straightway in a relatively fast way as experienced surgeon can enter, here you will encounter a lot of vascular adhesions, collaterals to the anterior abdominal wall, sides, etc. So if you do not give due attention to it, a major loss of blood could occur before you reach to your major work. Therefore, a type of incision also may need to be planned in a large spleen, where on this side, phrenic side and body wall side, a lot of collaterals and adhesions are there. If one go by thoracoabdominal incision in a very well padded right lateral position, one can get a very good access and have a good control of things. If one wants to do any other different shunt where the spleen is not very large, one can go by rooftop or midline incision. And if you want to work in the infracolic compartment, probably it may not be a problem. But then the large spleen, where most of the time we are going in for, could be a problem. That is one thing. Second thing, if there is any previous surgery, for example, in children, particularly some congenital anomalies which are operated like atrasias or for some other condition in a child, and then they carry on into older age, the collateral circulation develops around the anastomosis and around the incision site. So you have to be very, very careful to go there, and you have to keep in mind that portal hypertension might bleed from there itself. So this is another very important area. Then another thing, what is likely to happen when there is an obstruction over here in the portal circulation or in the presynaptic space, there is going to be increased congestion in the spleen, and therefore there will be congestive splenomegaly. This congestive splenomegaly will result into a lot of hematological problems, and therefore this is very important as far as management is concerned. Another point where I would like to put your attention to is this channel, what is splenorenal collateral, which is a natural spontaneous shunt which develops over a period of time. This is one way, a salutary effect of reducing portal hypertension, and similar such shunts would occur at several places, but they may not be effective. They could be effective in very small number of cases. This has led to one misconception about natural history of disease of this extrahepatic portal venous obstruction, that as these patients they grow, they outgrow this problem of portal hypertension. It is not. The bleeding might stop because portal pressure has come down. They might bleed, but they might not be a very exsanguinating bleeding. They might keep on losing bleeding, blood by melena, or a small amount of losses leading to anemia, failure to thrive, etc. But they will not be completely cured or right. Similar situation will occur after endotherapy. Endotherapy will cure, not cure, it will significantly reduce bleeding episodes, or if bleeds, it will be minor further after number of sclerotherapy sessions. But the quality of life, unless and until we tackle this problem, will not be there. So therefore, they will not outgrow their problem. Another important problem is very underestimated. If radiologically seen in such patient, almost literature quotes 70 to 100% will have radiological change of biliopathy. Out of which, if you see again literature quotes again 7 to 47% of the patients are becoming symptomatic for the biliopathy. So what we call a successful sort of development of natural history or taking care by pharmacotherapy or endotherapy and landing this patient subsequently after many years into biliopathy, which is extraordinarily difficult to handle. So there is another question to ponder here. Do we have a scope for any preemptive like prophylaxis, as we saw Rekshan, to prevent biliopathy? And it is a point definitely to ponder over, because large number of cases are going into biliopathy. Another area where subacute or bacterial endotoxemia, which keeps on occurring as a result of altered rheology in the portal circulation, and this would result into local DIC. Another important situation likely to occur, particularly in the intrahepatic type of situation, are hepatoportal or portopulmonary shunt development and development of respiratory complications. So there are a lot of problems which are occur. To stop hemorrhage is not only the goal of management of extrahepatic portal hypertension, but the improvement of overall quality along with the prevention of bleeding is the goal, and therefore we need to do certain active treatment, and here surgeon has got a major role to play. If I take you to the right hand figure here, you will see that the contribution of portal circulation for the liver is 75% and hepatic artery 25%. Portal circulation, even though it is venous, it provides maximum nutrients, hepatotrophic factors, and through liver after taking cerebral toxins, then the blood is diverted through systemic circulation to heart and then further. Now imagine a situation where portal vein is blocked or there is pre-sinusoidal block. A buffer effect is taken over for a transient period by hepatic artery. But hepatic artery is not going to substitute this. Therefore, this is also a very important point, and this will particularly occur when the spontaneous shunts they develop, and therefore they call a condition known as minimal hepatic encephalopathy. Some people who have studied this condition, and they say even though liver is normal, this condition is a reality on a long-term basis. So I want to send here a very clear message that extrahepatic portal venous obstruction patient, even though it starts from childhood, goes into the adulthood, they do not outgrow this problem. They need some active treatment. Now coming to some another issue, like what happens when there is a portal vein obstruction. We have got this collateral circulation around the yellow one is the biliary tree here. Then there is another one which is coming from the left gastric, and then it will be diverted here through the splenic vein. And when we do splenectomy and central shunt, the flow of blood will come to the renal and thence to the inferior vena cava. Now imagine a situation when the thrombus extends also into the superior mesenteric vein. So all these collateral around the choledochus and the gallbladder will get will not have any outflow tract there, and they will keep on dilating. Some of them will result into such a thick bunch of cavernomatous malformation that we have in next slide to be seen. So only one portal channel which is there, and that is draining, which will be ineffective. Now coming to very important applied aspects of this is a condition called biliopathy, which is very realistic, very problematic, and which occurs in a large number of patients, and which is at the moment is not sort of looked into until the symptoms are occurring there. So take a look here. Green one is the biliary tree, and these are peridocal, paradocal, epidocal, subepithelial. You name them, there are number of collateral circulation which is there. So what happens when there is cavernomatous malformation of portal vein here? There will be thick bunch which will be there, and which will be pressing over the bile duct, so which will be leading into indentation. Some of them would even enter into the lumen of bile duct, and this is extremely important from medical or the gastroenterologist point of view or the endoscopist point of view. When they try to take out sludge or stone or do sphincterotomy, while taking a sweeping maneuver, they might entangle into this intracholedochal collateral and result into damage and torrential bleeding while doing ERCP procedure. So when this is neglected and goes unnoticed over a period of time, it will result into ischemia of that region, recurrent inflammation, and therefore scarring of the choledochus, which results here with a peculiar stricture with proximal changes. So indentation, scarring, angulation, irregularity is a price to be paid for neglected extrahepatic portal venous obstruction, or so-called successful endotherapy, which 20 years later or 25 years later in a significant number of patients can present with a biliopathy. Now coming to another applied importance which has come up recently is a Rex rhesus. What is this Rex rhesus? Rex rhesus is a portal sinus where the umbilical vein which enters into the portal vein through that sinus. Umbilical system, right umbilical vein, left umbilical vein when it enters through the ductus venosus, and then through ductus venosus to the inferior vena cava, and then to the systemic circulation. This will be there in the fetal, and ductus venosus will be open till 2 weeks post birth, and it will get obliterated. So if you see the umbilical system, right umbilical duct, left umbilical duct, and ductus venosus, they all will get obliterated into ligamentum teres, ligamentum venosum. But the only portion which remains patent of umbilical system is what is known as this portal sinus, and this is called as Rex rhesus. It is named after the Hungarian pathologist who found it out, and which a surgeon, now surgeons have exploited that situation for creating the most physiological shunt, what is known as Rex rhesus. If you see this retrograde portogram, you can see here sort of vertically placed system in a diagrammatic situation. Here the umbilical vein coming here and entering into the rhesus. Then you have got 4A, 4B, segment 2, segment 3 collaterals coming on there to this vessel. We have to preserve them while reconstructing a shunt there, and this is the shunt which is created over there. I'll come into details of this shunt later on. I wanted to highlight about the applied anatomy of portal circulation. Its importance from surgeon point of view. We can't afford to miss it. Now coming to the causes of portal hypertension, I would like to focus your attention to this left-sided figure, and in the left-sided figure into these 3 sectors. This is known as the pre-hepatic area. This is known as the hepatic area, and amongst this hepatic area also, below this horizontal line is a sinusoid, and among sinusoid there will be on the right side. When I come, I'll explain to you in detail, and in the post-hepatic region you've got another thing. So I'm not going to deal with today with the sinusoid and the post-hepatic region. I will be focusing on these 3 sectors and the pre-sinusoidal sector. There are multiple causes which are given in the books which are there. The basic pathogen, before going to pathogenesis, I'll come to this area, what is known as pre-sinusoidal area. So this is the portal venule. Then through the sinusoid, it will connect to the central vein and thence to the hepatic venules and hepatic veins and entering into the system. So any lesion which is in the pre-sinusoidal region, very commonly seen in our setting is non-cirrhotic portal fibrosis or idiopathic portal fibrosis, or in pediatric age group congenital hepatic fibrosis, then schistosomiasis, and then many other conditions. What is important is that liver function is normal here, liver architecture, lobular architecture is well maintained, and therefore they also behave like a extrahepatic portal venous obstruction type of a scenario, and therefore I have included today in my talk. Now coming to the clinical presentation, extrahepatic portal venous obstruction and the pre-sinusoidal area, they can present at any age. Usually this is the problem of younger age group, young adults, and then it is carried on subsequently when it is mishandled or neglected by the patient, because there will be many a time a quiescent period, and therefore patients also neglect, and there are n number of causes where our patient fail to report also. What I would like to focus your attention to, that it is seen in neonates, it is seen in infants and toddlers. Usually this acute process of thrombus formation is missed because it behaves like any other abdominal pathology which can be managed conservatively, like any abdominal sepsis or excessive irritability, fever, etc. And then 3, 4, 5 days this process is settled down and the problem is forgotten over there. However, very minuscule number of patients would also have hematemesis, say around 3 to 4 years of age, but majority of the patient will sort of have a major first bleed somewhere between 7 to 12 years of age. So unexpected exsanguinating bleeding in a normal liver is the exact scenario here, where the death can occur because of non-availability of blood and difficulty of reaching to the hospital and non-availability of expertise. So this all focuses our attention to a surgeon's expertise. We need to ourselves be prepared to handle such cases. Then there are various different types of presentation one can encounter. Usually there would be 3, 4 type of association with each, where one can really happen to see such type of cases. I will not go into the detail, but what I would like to focus this last point: prior diagnosed right or wrong and received some treatment. This is very, very common scenario where patients are admitted, blood transfusion is given, some hematinics are given, and patients are sent home. By natural history of disease, some of them they don't bleed, some of them they bleed minor, they don't report to the hospital, or some of them they come in a right way, again they are transfused and sent home. The wrong way of diagnosis is that some of them directly labeled as cirrhosis of liver and given a very dire green prognosis and asked them to go and take some medical treatment. So this is not at all uncommon scenario. Vary of this, if needed, you can re-establish your own diagnosis when patient comes to you with such situations. The rest of the things I think are pretty straightforward. Now coming to the evaluation of this patient, if you take ultrasound and endoscopy, almost 90% of the diagnosis or 95% of the diagnosis of portal hypertension will be done. The rest of the tests are very essential. Say, for example, CBC is done for hemoglobin and evidence of hyposplenism. Liver function tests are non-specific, but they are yet important because they can give you clue for any hepatic parenchymal issues. Then there are say inflammation or infection, obstructive and very synthetic. These are the various liver function tests which will take care of all this type of synthetic, specialized tests and the basic tests. Ultrasound or color Doppler, why it is important? Because it will give you number of ideas or information about what as a surgeon you need. Patency of the splenoportal axis, extent of the thrombus, collaterals present or not, physicity, velocity, relation with the respiration, diameters of the vessels which are required for the operation, any other associated condition, and also in the post-op period for the assessment of shunt and overall assessment of a patient if there is ascites and other collection. So ultrasound, color Doppler is a very important arm of investigation. Endoscopy, of course, presence or absence of varicose, they are esophageal, or they are gastric, esophagogastric, gastropathy, ectopic, their size, extent, risk factor, again in the post-op period, pre-op assessment, etc., and of course therapeutic use as well. The cause of portal hypertension, as I said, most of the time thrombotic episodes in our situations are due to repeated dehydration episodes, or there could be history of umbilitis or umbilical vein cannulation, etc. But most of the time you do not get this history, and repeated dehydration episode resulting into low flow state, formation of thrombus is the commonest cause. But in the Western world, whenever such patient is seen with extrahepatic portal hypertension, they would first start evaluating from prothrombotic state. However, in our situations also, we could be missing certain states because of non-availability of such tests at a very cheap and easy availability. But if we go into the depth, some 20-30% of our patient would definitely will be positive for such tests. Then liver biopsy is not mandatory. It will be needed only when there is status of liver function or damage evidence is there. For example, there is abnormality in liver function test, or if there is patent splenoportal axis. It means you might not be dealing every time with cirrhosis. It could be pre-sinusoidal, and you can get a very important, good information on liver biopsy. So, and people who are diagnosis it wrongly as a cirrhosis and patient is carrying on for decades together with the label of cirrhosis, certainly a liver biopsy will settle the issue. This test, vascular anatomy for roadmap, is usually required when you plan surgery. But this hepatic venous portal pressure gradient, I'll come to it later, which is a gold standard today. This retrograde photography is very essential for diagnosing and correct anatomy of Rex rhesus and studying. CT and MR angio both are done, but CT is very commonly available, cheaper, and motion degradation of image is far less. This is particularly of importance in child. In adults also it is important. Therefore, most of the time CT angiography, even though it exposes to little more radiation, will be advisable. And of course, biliopathy to be evaluated by ERCP, confirmed, stenting, sphincterotomy, etc. can be done. I would just like to focus your attention to this hepatic venous pressure gradient, which is usually done for sinusoidal and post-sinusoidal area. However, we have got important area of pre-sinusoidal here also, which can be differentiated from cirrhosis. And it is important and the gold standard taken for diagnosis of portal hypertension and prophylaxis and in prognosticating predominantly, particularly if the patient is kept on pharmacotherapy, you need to bring down pressure with the beta blocker by 20%. And how that 20% will be decided by this wage hepatic pressure or this pressure gradient. So it is extremely important as far as portal hypertension area is concerned. Now, if this pressure goes beyond gradient goes beyond 10, it indicates clinically significant portal hypertension. What does it mean to us as a surgeon? Because nowadays portosplenogram or any other such type of study is not done. Therefore, we are not doing pulse pressure or Holter pressure. So if this study is it reflects portal pressure. So a gradient of 10 indicates roughly there is 10 portal venous pressure and there is significant portal hypertension. You can label that is clinical manifestation of portal hypertension will start. And further prognosticating things are also there depending upon the. It will be extremely useful for our specialized surgeon like liver transplant surgeon, that which patient need to be taken early for liver transplant. Though we as a majority number of surgeons may not be doing liver transplant, but again from surgeon's point of view this is important. I would like to focus your attention to pre-sinusoidal. Here there is raised portal venous pressure, but rest of the thing, wage, free hepatic and HVPG are normal. Whereas in sinusoidal, whenever there is confusion between sinusoidal and pre-sinusoidal, this can be immediately solved by this method. Acute variceal bleeding or upper GI bleeding is a very standard, very routinely practiced. I am not going to go into the details of it. Stabilization, evaluation, treatment is initial goal. All these go hand in hand and simultaneously can be evaluated. I am going to focus on these two things, balloon tamponade and the role of surgery here. Balloon tamponade, it is the historical device gone into the archives. A big no would be there, though it may not be routinely used because of good pharmacotherapy and endotherapy. But it's an excellent bridge, particularly when one would like to transfer case from periphery, where even at periphery, a surgeon who is having endoscope, who has attempted his best or try to control hemorrhage, prevent exsanguination, and to send to some referral center, proper tertiary center, he can definitely use this tube and send patient in a safe way, though it is not as easy. It's a difficult and it's a very carefully you have to apply. Secondly, if you are working in a tertiary hospital, even though you have to keep this tube and should not be put into the dusty corner of endoscopy suite, because whenever there is massive bleeding, pharmacotherapy, endotherapy which fails, and there is time to get surgical theater, if the blood group is rare, you have to arrange. So even though you are working in a tertiary center, even though there is a team, there is a bridging time of few hours which is required before death and giving a curative type of surgery to the patient. So during that period also it can be used as a very good bridge. Then I would like to focus your attention to the port shunts and devascularization procedure. Shunts certainly are not done even in extra hepatic portal hypertension in an emergency situation. But if things work out, if you are confident everything works and patient is stable, nonetheless, there is no strict or absolute contraindication one can carry it out. The chances of thrombosis and other issues are likely to be there. Therefore, it is always better to avoid shunt surgery in the emergency. However, I would like to focus your attention to non-shunt or ablative or devascularization procedures here. The reason being, it comes very handy when you are in difficulty. Again, a peripheral surgeon who is not very much adept to typical portal hypertension surgery, or he is not having facilities with him, he can easily give life-saving procedure to the patient. These are usually salvaging procedures carried out. Many of them are gone out of into oblivion, but the most important one which is still remaining is the modified Sugiura procedure, which is extensive abdominal devascularization and splenectomy. This procedure works very well, and US truly has done around 20 plus such procedure with a maximum follow-up of 30 years of one case and good number of follow-up in more than 10 years of cases, which they are doing equally good like shunt surgery. So if it is obsolete, I won't agree, because in our scenario, this is very important. You may not have shuntable vein, you may not have other facilities, you may not, you might have already exhausted shunt, say Dean Warren shunt or distal pyloric shunt or other shunt is done, where the spleen is preserved, but patient comes with block shunt, thrombus shunt, bleeding, unable to manage with endoscopy, unable to manage with pharmacotherapy. You have no alternative but to resort to this therapy. So modified Sugiura is a good procedure. Then only splenectomy is never indicated except left-sided portal hypertension, where it is a curative procedure. Other situations it is not indicated. Another point I would like to highlight is a good contribution to portal hypertension surgery from our own Indian surgeon from KM Hospital, Dr. S.K. Mathur. He does transabdominal esophagogastric devascularization plus gastroesophageal stapling plus minus splenectomy. With this, he has shown equally good, if not better, results as shunt even done in emergency. So there is definitely scope as far as our scenarios are concerned. Then there are other extreme degree of spectrum of people who are doing lower esophagectomy and upper gastrectomy with esophagoenteric anastomosis, either using colon or roux loop of jejunum. Only unique person probably in North America, Orloff, he practices and he quotes that 0% mortality and only 5% rebleed rate in an emergency situation done this surgery. It is not successful in many hands, I mean most of the hands, and therefore it's not popular all over the world. Now coming to the goals of management, here I am talking about secondary prophylaxis. When the emergency management has been done, and now you have to manage this patient on a long-term basis. The goal, important goal, is undoubtedly prevention of rebleeding by adequate portal decompression. However, prevention of encephalopathy, improving quality of life, particularly on all the domains such as physical, social, scholastic, and emotional, by really validated tool is extremely important, because not only saving patient and keeping him nutritionally debilitated, negative personality, not attending school, not going to work, and constantly visiting hospital and under the fear of next bleeding and the looming death. So all these things are extremely important as a part of the goal, not only controlling bleeding. And when you plan surgical intervention, what is most important is pre-splenectomy vaccination at least 2 weeks prior. You can give as much earlier period, but 2 weeks prior, because opsonization is done in the spleen, and therefore presence of spleen is extremely essential as far as prevention of OPSI is concerned. Post-splenectomy antibiotic prophylaxis, its duration to be given or not given, there is a lot of controversy, because hardly if we take collective experience, people say they have seen OPSI in our situation, particularly after portal hypertension or trauma surgery, splenectomy, etc. So duration of antibiotic prophylaxis is really a questionable mark. What I follow is first 2 years are very common as far as overwhelming sepsis is concerned. Therefore, I cover them with PenV or Penti tablet 400 milligram BD for 2 years, and then subsequently, depending upon compliance and if necessary. Now, coming to the principles of management, I would like to focus your attention to certain definitions, because again, management plan is changing. As I said earlier, preemptive surgical shunt is becoming a reality. What is pre-primary prophylaxis? Prevention of variceal formation. So people are in such meetings, which is every 3-4 yearly, taking the stock of portal hypertension from all over the world, are now coming to the area of discussion of pre-primary prophylaxis. Today there is no clear-cut indication, but some people have suggested even REC shunt as a pre-primary prophylaxis also. Whereas another definition, primary prophylaxis, is prevention of first bleed. So beta blockers, endotherapy, and nowadays surgery, REC shunt has been advised. As far as children are concerned, there is no evidence of beta blocker and endotherapy helping. Whereas in adults, there is definitely benefit of beta blocker, non-specific beta blockers and endotherapy. But the results of REC shunts are far superior as far as growth of the liver, volume of the liver improvement, neurocognitive abilities, decrease in the spleen, and overall growth, physical growth of a patient. So REC shunt is being used as a preemptive shunt. And secondary prophylaxis, prevention of recurrent bleeding, here, which is a lot of controversial area. Being a surgeon, I am going to focus here. Nevertheless, I will not ignore these therapies, but this is not the time today to focus on this therapy. For any given patient of extrahepatic or intrahepatic portal hypertension, pharmacotherapy and endoscopic therapy, endotherapy, are usually nowadays considered as first-line therapy. But subsequently, for the secondary prophylaxis, once the acute episode is managed, or in secondary prophylaxis for some time, getting a buying time to organize things for major surgical procedures, this time can be utilized. But considering sole endoscopic therapy, pharmacotherapy, or tips for extrahepatic portal hypertension, unendingly giving to the patient for unlimited number of times could be detrimental to the patient and very disastrous to the family. So therefore, surgeon has got definitely active role to play as far as surgery is concerned. Now, what way surgeon can come into the picture is surgeon can come in the form of shunts, non-shunt or ablative or devascularization procedure, which I have already covered, and liver transplant. Liver transplant is another only curative treatment. Here, surgeon is not doing portal, liver transplant is exclusively for portal hypertension, but it is for the progressive liver or hepatic failure for which the shunt is done, for which the liver transplant is done, and that will be curative in such situation of portal hypertension. How the portal hypertension triggers this failure is very interesting to know, because massive bleed, or if any shunt or TIPS procedure is done, there is possibility of encephalopathy, or if there is any major bleed, the deterioration in the liver function is far too faster. So therefore, though bleeding, hematemesis or blood loss or TIPS like procedure, which is an inciting factor, ultimately liver transplant is done for liver failure and not exclusively for bleeding varices. Now, thus coming to our major area, previously we would classify shunts into selective and non-selective. Now, as I said, with the changing era, the classification of shunt is being done now as physiologic shunts. The only physiologic shunt today we are having is MRB, that is mesorex bypass, mesoportal bypass shunt, or non-physiologic shunt, which are then subsequently divided into selective. Selective means only selected area like distal splenorenal shunt, or partially selective, where the diameter of the shunt is reduced so that part of the blood flow, portal blood flow, is maintained to the liver, but which has never remained successful, and various non-selective shunts, which are again extremely useful in the scenario which we are going to talk today. Now, how to decide which type of a management to be given? It is not as though very straightforward. Definitely needs to be individualized, taking into all these parameters into account. Age is very important. For example, if a infant or a toddler starts bleeding or starts giving clinical manifestations of portal hypertension, one would try to hold on major emergency surgery or even for that matter, secondary prophylaxis, and buy time with pharmacotherapy and endotherapy. Not that surgery is contraindicated, surgery can be done. Rex bypass can be done. Even side-to-side lienorenal shunt, Mitra shunt, which I will come later on, can be done even as 4 millimeter or 5 millimeter diameter of a splenic vein also. But age is definitely very important part. Then type and cause of portal hypertension, as I said, is extremely important while taking into consideration of plan of treatment. Splenic size and evidence of hypersplenism. You can't keep on doing endotherapy, pharmacotherapy, tips, and just controlling only hemorrhage and ignoring this. Then bleeding source. This may happen that patient is having esophageal varices, or patient may have gastric varices or gastropathy or ectopic varices. In a patient who is having isolated esophageal varices, endoscopy with EVL or sclerotherapy will take care of esophageal varices. But in a follow-up period, patient might develop gastric varices. So what to do? Is endotherapy suitable now, or surgical intervention or interventional radiological intervention is to be considered? This is a very important point. Similarly, the situation of gastropathy. Endoscopy cannot control gastropathy. Ectopic varices, if you cannot reach there, you cannot handle them. For gastric varices, people have tried endoscopic glue injection. Jokingly, people say that people have spoiled more gastroscope than managed more gastric varices in a better way. So definitely there is point to ponder here for surgeon's role. Vascular anatomy and feasibility of construction of a shunt is extraordinarily important. You may have everything, but vascular anatomy is not suitable. You cannot do the procedure. Compliance and geographical location of a patient, extremely important again in our scenario. Patient might be compliant, he is willing to come, but if he is not having proper facilities, or if he is willing to come and would like to take time for taking decision for particular therapy, all pharmacotherapy, endotherapy can be tried. But if a compliant patient who is finding because of geographical area to get attention of specialty unit, and perhaps even though compliance and everything is there, he can come, but sheer because of location and inability and the fear of examination might not select endotherapy and would like to undergo for surgery, which is a one-time procedure. Of course, expertise and availability of healthcare facility. It's not only the skill of a surgeon as an individual, you need entire team, because human resource while operating in such cases in the operation room cannot be underestimated. Everyone, nursing staff, assistant, floating people, all are important. Supportive managed from blood banking facility, pathology, and intensive care pathologist, physiotherapist, everyone is extremely important, and therefore multidisciplinary team or a creation, a pulling of all these cases to one place, so everybody's experience improves, and ultimately you can start delivering better and better result. Any previous procedure done, for example, TIPS procedure done, now patient is bleeding, or some shunt done, now spleen was intact, you have to go in and do splenectomy devascularization, or you have already done shunt, now there is no way to handle thing, a rescue endotherapy can be used. So it's not that endotherapy versus surgery, all therapies are complemented to each other. The decision is to be taken jointly, and that is how the best of the benefit of the technology and the time and the expertise given to the patient. What is most important is long-term follow-up, because a given patient who is coming very regularly suddenly will find that it is not possible for him to come regularly every 2 weekly for endotherapy. He might request for a definitive procedure, or as I said earlier, esophageal varices might get settled, but patient will develop different varices. Or a patient who is younger, now has grown up, want to go to school, involved into active participation of sports and many other activities, but for the fear of trauma, for the fear of bleeding, family not allowing to go him out, and the psychological issues arising. So the pattern or the advice to the patients will change. So why surgical intervention? This is my small data, which was up to 216. Subsequently, previously I would do somewhere around 4 to 6 cases a year. Then slowly last 4 years, 1 or 2 cases a year. So therefore not many cases are added. If you can see here, gastrointestinal bleeding, which cannot be tackled with endoscopy. painful splenomegaly, hyposplenism. Patient is fed up of all these things. Failure to thrive along with all this. Nutrition is gone. A 14, 15 years old boy looking like a 5-year-old boy and unable to pursue schooling, or a young adult who cannot pursue his job, social issues like marriage and other things. These relative indication, according to some, I feel is extremely important. Long distance, red blood group, repeated anesthesia, intercurrent bleeding episode, economics, and quality of life, which nobody gives thought to. When your kith and kin is affected, perhaps we will realize this. This is extremely important, not only controlling bleeding. Now, what is failure of endoscopic management? In acute emergency, it is known that within 24-48 hours, if you attempt it twice and bleeding still continues, it is called as failed emergency endotherapy. But there is no such definition for chronic endotherapy, which goes on for years and years. Patient loses interest, doctor loses interest, patient lands up into complication, and therefore large number of such patients which need to be really decided earlier in the course. Otherwise, they can land up into portal biliopathy and many other complications which I have already talked many times. Now, coming to the surgical portosystemic shunts, we all are very excited when we heard the word of shunts. These is really a crowded, confusing, complex diagram, which is as complex as the surgical procedure is concerned. Therefore, to indicate how complexities of these issues are there, I have kept all of them in single slide. Subsequently, side-to-side lienorenal shunt, central splenorenal shunt, distal splenorenal shunt, I will focus more details. There is another, so if you see, there are two selective shunt, that is distal splenorenal shunt and this interposition gap between portal vein and this what is known as surface shunt, which is reduced diameter of Dacron graft, which is kept here. The thrombosis is extremely common in such shunts, and if the liver sinusoidal pressure keeps on increasing, there is hepatofugal flow, and the purpose for which the shunt is kept in order to maintain hepatopetal flow is lost, and therefore this has never become a very popular one. Warren shunt, yes, some popularity it enjoyed, but it is again not very commonly used. Side to side and central splenorenal shunt, I'm going to talk on very detailed subsequently, and these are portocaval and mesocaval shunt. So let's go to details of all these. Now, portocaval shunts. The first portocaval shunt was described way back by Eck, and is named after Eck fistula. That complete division of portal vein, it is carried out again. Most of these procedures were carried out for hepatic parenchymal disease. That time there was no definition of what is cirrhosis and what is extrahepatic portal hypertension till 1940s and all, when things started clearing out, all different types of procedure and clarity on all this coming out. But we have, this procedure is such an enigmatic one. Still today, people talk about portocaval shunts. People still enjoy discussing, talking, and therefore I thought it will be prudent here to highlight this. This would take care. Decompression of portal circulation is very good, but hepatic encephalopathy, rebleeding, complications of shunt like thrombosis, etc., are very common. So such patients were having problems because of other issues also. And ascites was not handled very well by this. Therefore, people thought side-to-side portocaval shunt should be done. That to some great extent taken care of ascites. But what happened, as the natural history of disease of intrahepatic obstruction, that increased vascular resistance occurred in a ongoing progressive liver disease. It resulted into hepatofugal flow. You just observe here the arrows. The flow of hepatopetal flow for which it was designed is reversed over a period of time because of hepatofugal flow. So the purpose for which it was done, with a high mortality, encephalopathy creation and all, they have gone out of favor. Presently, in a pre-sinusoidal hepatic obstruction, portal vein obstruction, where splenoportal axis is very much patent there, you can consider side-to-side portocaval shunt. But if you are having other different options which are relatively familiar, relatively easy to clear, why not do that? Therefore, portocaval shunt, even though it is feasible, it can be done but it is generally not even done even in that situation also. Now, similar situation is mesocaval shunt. You can imagine here severing of inferior vena cava just above the bifurcation and hooking it on end to side to the mesenteric vein. Again, the same fate, hepatopital converting into hepatophygal depending upon the intrahepatic pressure rise. So, such a major procedure, complications of failure of collateralization below beyond pelvic region and failure rates. This is again gone out of favor. The other procedure came into favor was a jump graft or an edge graft between superior mesenteric vein and inferior vena cava. This was particularly popular in children. Autologous vein or Dacron PTFE graft, which is used. Again, thrombosis was a major problem. Effective decompression was not possible. Nevertheless, if the vein is possible, is available, shuntable, it can be done. For example, if somebody has done central shunt or somebody has done Dean-Warren shunt, somebody has done Mitra shunt, side to side lateral shunt, patient is bleeding, you have got still this option if the superior mesenteric vein which is available there before going in for splenectomy and devascularization. So these are some very ultra selective situations where you might wonder to consider this. Now, coming to the most talked of and as if it is a panacea, what people consider distal splenorenal shunt, Dean-Warren shunt, or selective shunt. All are synonyms. What is most important? What happens in this shunt? The esophageal varices, which are selectively decompressed through the short gastric vein, coming to the adrenal or splenic vein, and then thence to the renal vein, and thence to the inferior vena cava. It sounds very nice, it appears very attractive, and it is considered as a selective one. But I'll tell you why the selectivity is lost over a period of time. The most important thing when you consider in extrahepatic portal venous obstruction, all our patients which we are taking for surgery is having grade 3, grade 4 spleen. Very selected few may have if they come early in grade 1 or 2. In grade 3 and 4, there will be a lot of technical difficulty in constructing this shunt. Secondly, even after effective reconstruction, hyperplanism doesn't disappear completely, it remains there. Thrombocytopenia improves, but not completely. So these are the limitations of that situation when spleen is large or even if spleen is visible. Second important issue, whenever you say it is very good, the technical details or how the procedure is carried out is extremely important. Why? This procedure requires extensive devascularization or ligation division of gastroepiploic arcade. Second, the most important thing is if you want to have good selectivity, you have to completely dissect it from the pancreatic bed till splenic hilum. What it means for people who are not doing it, perhaps might appear, so what, it can be dissected. But those who are doing the surgery will vouch, will not disagree with me that how fragile pancreatico-splenic collaterals, somewhere between 8 to 10, which are very constant, which bleeds, cannot control them with any energy device such as bipolar or harmonic or anything. You have to patiently ligate them very carefully. That itself is an art and a very cumbersome procedure. So unless and until that is done, this is going to lose selectivity. I'll tell you later on. The third important point, technical point of this procedure is ligation of this left gastric vein or coronary vein. Many times this vein is not ligated, it is not mentioned into the notes. So a selectivity of shunt is likely to be lost because of non-availability of details or non-following of very scrupulous dissection as far as this shunt is concerned. Another important point of this shunt is that when you mobilize completely this vein and then you mount it on renal vein, there is a possibility of kink there, either because of redundancy or because of your technical fault of siting it. You have to give an oblique incision on the renal vein, and the lie of the shunt should be very gradual one, so that there is no kink there, or there is no extra sort of a suture related or technique related issue which results into thrombosis, stenosis, and obstruction of a shunt. So considering all this, It appears to be very nice when it was done for hepatic parenchymal disease originally, because Dean Warren, after fed up with all this caval and portacaval and mesocaval shunt, designed this shunt, and therefore it gained popularity in those earlier era, and it served few years quite well. In situation when, as I told you, if this dissection is not carried out well, or even if it is carried out well, if all this vein not ligated properly, over a period of time, all this circulation around here, when the pressure inside the liver increases, or the portal vein is blocked, in case the point which we are talking about today, a new bunch of collateral around the head of pancreas, taking very named and unnamed veins, they form a very, very big bunch around here. And if pancreatic veins are not very well dissected, the whole blood flow could be directed there, sucked there, what is known as pancreatic siphon. So this pancreatic siphon effect results into loss of selectivity of so-called selective shunt, distal splenorenal shunt. So complex to construct and losing selectivity, high mortality even after constructing, even though good results are there. It is feasible in children even with 7 mm vein. There is definitely need for a wider vein, etc. So a lot of issues are there with this shunt. Therefore, it is not popular among pediatric age group, and definitely not depending upon the spleen and other issues are concerned. Now coming to the most popular shunts which are practiced in children as well as in adults. Proximal splenorenal shunt, central splenorenal shunt, conventional splenorenal shunt, or Clatworthy shunt. These are all the names synonymous to each other depending upon how you use it. So central splenorenal shunt, proximal shunt, conventional shunt. It is carried out always with a splenectomy. Now, I will start by photograph one by one as per the dissection of this. Patient is posed, as I told you, the large spleen is there. You have to go by thoracoabdominal incision, so entire surface is under vision. You can go by midline incision, you can go by rooftop incision as well, but this is very convenient incision. Adequate is very monitoring urine important. First, you ligate pancreatic artery so that splenic size over a period of time will decrease. And even if subsequently by handling bleeding occurs, it can be controlled with relative ease. Then you dissect splenic vein. You have to go as away as Y-shaped bifurcation, which will be always there, upper segment, lower segment. So you have to go inside, handle it minimally, clearly separate it from tail of the pancreas, then ligate it. Minimal handling of the portal splenic vein is a very important criteria. Then you take out spleen and go on dissecting splenic vein from the pancreatic bed by ligating such multiple collateral vasculature, remaining away, not handling repeatedly, even though you have got very nice vascular forceps. And that is how the splenic vein is harvested. Then you go into the posterior thing. Yeah, I'll complete. Hello? And another 5 to 10 minutes. So renal vein is harvested after taking care of posterior fat, which is usually rich with lymphatic, and therefore you have to take it very meticulously, otherwise post-operative ascites is not uncommon. Now you hook it on to the renal vein with oblique anastomosis without kink, and generally the lie of this anastomosis is extremely good. You can see here, and the kink is less likely, and it is very effective. And at the end, you take liver biopsy. See, this is what our central shunt is. You are hooked up it here, you have done splenectomy, and you don't ligate here left gastric vein, so that this collateral circulation, this will empty it very well. Now coming to the side-to-side lienorenal shunt, here it is usually in the infracolic compartment, therefore rooftop incision, and you select, you go to the ligament of Treitz, ligate inferior mesenteric vein, and gently separate splenic vein from the pancreatic vein. You give traction on the pancreas, not on the vein. That is extremely important. And again, technically demanding, because you have to dissect quite a bit of length, because it should come into your vascular fossa. So you retract pancreas and not take away vein from it. Similarly, you ligate gonadal vein, adrenal vein, and mobilize renal vein. Put umbilical tape around as a safety precaution. Then apply those forceps and do the anastomosis as per the vascular technique. Rex shunt, as I told you, rooftop incision, midline incision. This is very important. There is always a liver tissue between two lobes or caudate lobe. This tissue has to come out for the exposure of the Rex rhesus. Okay, Rex rhesus is reached here as you follow the ligamentum teres. Now, once you, this is the umbilicus or ligamentum teres. This is a vertically disposed Rex shunt, and now you go here. You have got segment 4A, 4B vessels, segment 2, 3 vessels. You have to keep away from your application here, not to ligate them, just hook around and then release subsequently. Apply your clamp here and construct ready for the shunt. Next step would be harvesting the left internal jugular vein. Usually left side is selected, right side is in future might require for cardiac catheterization and many other procedures. This is how the jugular vein, autologous jugular vein is taken out. These two, usual dissection for the identification and dissection of superior mesenteric vein is done. And a tunnel is created anterior to the pancreas, posterior to the pylorus. So transmesocolic, pre-pancreatic, retropyloric tunnel creation for the bypass. So M is the superior mesenteric, this is pancreas, this is the tunnel, this is the stomach, and this is the colon which is lifted up. And this is the completion of rhesus anastomosis first, the free end which will be anastomosed to the superior mesenteric vein and the completed shunt. I will leave this. I thought some case scenarios I will dissect, but I'll, because of time, I'll not do. The take-home message is that we will not be doing shunt for this, but our colleague, specialist colleague, liver transplantation will be done. Therefore, surgeon role is cannot be again undermined. We will be doing shunt procedure in all these conditions which I had already discussed. So we have got a tremendous role to play. Take home message again. Type of procedure depends upon anatomical availability, patency and size of vein, splenic size and expertise, etc. Splenectomy PSRS is one-time effective and very suitable shunt. Modified Sugira is very handy in desperate situation. Mesorex bypass is most physiological and recommended also for primary prophylaxis. It can work out even for adults also. We should work in a multidisciplinary team because we can't afford to sort of forget veno-venous anastomosis, which is very precious and hard-earned and well-honed art. This is what I would like to send a message, that we should reorient ourselves and be a part of the team. Thank you very much. Sorry for some overshooting time.
Oh, thank you so much, Raju. It was extremely lucid and detailed discussion from your side on portal hypertension. Am I audible?
Yes, very much.
Hello.
Yes, very much.
So, Raju, this has been extremely lucid discussion from your side. And just to start ball rolling, I will ask you a few questions. And one of that is, have you ever used devascularization as a prophylaxis?
No, I haven't used it because most of these patients which we get are as a rescue procedure. You know,
right.
From a physician colleague, they will be doing endotherapy when such patients either disappear from them or they are unable to give relief from hypersplenism, large spleen and other issues. Then they are referred generally. Per se, I haven't done as a prophylaxis, but I think there could be a role at all in this.
There is one paper from All India Institute. They have done a couple of cases and they have documented that there has been substantial decrease in rebleeding rate in these patients, and it has acted well as a prophylaxis.
Yeah, quite. I mean, I can't deny that. I am very sure that it will be.
I suppose this topic is open for further discussion and question may be asked by the audience.
Yeah, Rajvilas, you have any comment?
Yeah,
We have another.
I'm Dr. Rajvilas here. It was a fantastic and wonderful presentation with such a nice illustration, right from the anatomy till the process and small steps of the surgery, which were detailedly discussed. So one question from my side is that, sir, so what is your experience of using rec shunt as a primary prophylaxis? To be frank, I mean, me being a quite junior, we have hardly seen these shunts being done in the centers, even it's a high volume center as well. So I mean, what is your experience in this?
Yeah, thank you, Rajvilas. That way, I am also junior as far as this shunt is concerned. I have done 3 cases. What is most important is the anatomy. Apart from everything else, good number of times you do not get proper information about left portal vein or SMV. The most ideal investigation is retrograde photography. For the want of various reasons, the patients which they come to us as a rescue procedure, while attempting it to demonstrate it on table, what I did, I put infant feeding tube number 5 to the umbilical ligament and introduce contrast medium. That works out quite well. You can see there, but it is not as clear definition as that, and one can construct. So if I have done these 3 cases, I must tell you, after reaching there, I had to wind up because that vein was not suitable. Second time when I went inside, while dissecting that vein from this issue, the bleeding which started, which was very difficult to control there, so I closed there and resorted to splenectomy devascularization. The third one, I could do it well. In the post-operative period, it got stenosed. So for doing this procedure, you need to have a very good backup of even interventional radiologist. I am planning to refer to our interventional radiologist colleague to sort of dilate, balloon dilatation. Apart from this, I don't have personal experience and definitely not of prophylaxis, but I am very curious and I am eagerly awaiting to do.
Okay. Sir, actually, I mean, in the traditional teaching, rec shunt was not taught primarily as a primary prophylaxis. It's always been told that it is used as a secondary prophylaxis when patients present normally with bleed. Because these patients don't get diagnosed to have EHPVO without any bleeding episodes. So, I mean, to be frank, we have never heard that Rex shunt is used for as a primary prophylaxis. More commonly, it was told for a secondary only. That's why just it was my curiosity. How frequently it is used now as a primary prophylaxis, despite using endoscopy or a pharmacotherapy?
First of all, you must understand this is a new type of a procedure which has come in. Secondly, in the last Webino 6 satellite meeting, this has been ratified. Now it has to percolate to all over the world, and then the collective experience will build up over next 10, 15, 20 years. So right now you are right. You haven't heard, quite naturally, if you haven't sort of required to do this procedure. So that could be the reason.
Sir, I guess the reason one or the other reason could be the PSRS shunt is far easier as compared to Rex. I'm not saying PSRS is easier. When we compare Rex versus PSRS shunt, PSRS is comparatively a easier shunt to perform. So inclination toward PSRS is far more as compared to Rex.
Yeah, because
That's
the
right.
most important thing for which we are doing is large spleen.
Yeah.
See, if you do
large spleen also.
If
and
you
moreover, you must understand this rec shunt is a new one and it is not so easy. It is not so easy. It's technically very difficult and challenging also.
Yes, sir.
Right, sir.
Yes, sir. So can
Raju, I have another question for you.
Yes.
In this extrahepatic portal vein obstruction, one of the theories is portal vein, congenital obliteration of portal vein.
Okay.
And is it associated with any other associated congenital anomalies in these children?
Yes, it is associated and other anomalies of like persistence of ductus venosus and
Okay.
directly bypassing liver and entering into the circulation, resulting into hyperdynamic circulation and stealing of the blood, resulting into congestive cardiac failure, hyperammonemia, and liver, that type of a situation where child presents with congestive heart failure. Then there are other associated biliary tract anomalies which are known to occur with this. So they are there, but again, not a very
They are
common
rare.
thing. Yeah,
Ah.
they are very.
They are rare. Another, what kind of pre-splenectomy vaccination you are using?
I give pneumococcal vaccine, which is P23. Another vaccine which is available is P9. P23
Okay.
takes care of 23 strain. It is
Ah.
better than P9. That is at least given to be 2 weeks prior. Then Haemophilus influenzae and meningococcal. All
Okay.
these are effective against the capsulated organisms.
Okay.
That's right.
So, sir, I have one more question. So, how is the follow-up protocol of the shunt patients? Sorry, Rajesh Singhvi sir has a question first. Rajesh sir, go ahead, sir. Singhvi sir.
Yeah, very nice talk, Dr. Sauji. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you very much.
Most of these patients has hypersplenism and some unexplainable coagulopathy. As I remember, we did few cases together, and some of these patients, although the preoperative coagulopathy was done extensively, but still they bled more than what we expected. So anything extra, any sixth sense, how to develop that sixth sense and how to know that this patient is going to bleed more? Any comments on this management of preoperative coagulopathy?
Yeah, very, very good question. And that is why I very sort of emphatically stress there that these patients do not outgrow of their portal hypertension. The problem is subclinical. Hello? Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, yes, sir, yes, sir.
The problem of this bleeding is one of the reasons given for this is subclinical endotoxemia, which results into local or low-grade DIC. And that is one situation. Secondly, when we do cases, very rarely in our scenario, we are evaluating them for prothrombotic states. If perhaps we are missing them. Thirdly, could be our technical issue as well while handling and then setting in the process. Number 4, the basic pathophysiology of this any portal hypertension is that there is hyperdynamic circulation and expanded plasma volume capacitance. So if the anesthetic is inadvertently, in order to cover sort of hemoglobin and blood pressure to pump in lot of fluids, this can also result into intraoperative bleeding diathesis. No particular single reason, or you can you have to just overall anesthetic. You yourself have to understand this is the pathology and go extremely carefully. It does not occur very oftenly, but yes, it can occur. And there is, I don't think preemptively we can think of in this particular patient it is going to occur and in this it will occur. Provided you are missing out some hepatic parenchymal disease, or there is some doubtful laboratory investigation which has not given proper information, etc.
Just to add on that, many a times we all surgeons are worried about the low platelet count.
Yeah.
But I must say that low platelet count, which can be right up to below 30,000 even, we have operated these patients. Quality of platelets is normal in these patients. So low platelet count in itself is not a contraindication for going ahead with splenectomy or devascularization or shunt procedures. So thrombocytopenia in this patient as a part of hypersplenism is never a surgical contraindication, unless it's very low, like less than 5,000 or so. I have operated patients at 20,000 even, without even infusions of platelets and anything. As soon as you finish off with your splenectomy, your platelet counts get better. Correct. I think Raju, you will agree with that point.
Yeah.
As soon as you ligate splenic artery, you will start seeing the difference there in the platelet count as well. There are n number of times, even Dr. Rajesh Singhvi can vouch for it, that even in single digit platelet count, we operated 8,000, 9,000, 6,000, like that.
That's right.
Yeah.
Without giving platelet count.
Sir, we have a question from Dr. Dhananjay Kane, sir. Kane, sir, I have unmuted your mic. Kane, sir, please go ahead and ask the question. So Kane, sir, is not online. He has put a question in question panel here. How to establish non-cirrhotic portal fibrosis clinically?
Clinically, okay, very good question. This is usually seen in young adults, particularly females, from a low socioeconomic background. That is another clinically important point. The most important clinical examination point is very large splenomegaly, very large spleen, which is there in this age group of patient, and sometimes occasional mild ascites, which is there but may not be there. Again, in females, menorrhagia is very common as far as these patients are concerned. So large spleen is a hallmark of this condition.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Raju,
Doctor,
I heard for the first time this hypothalamic concept.
Yeah.
Hypothalamic concept of portal hypertension. Can you just elaborate more on that?
No, there are two portal systems in our body. One is hepatic portal system, which we have discussed. There is another portal system, which is hypophyseal portal system, they call, which connects between anterior pituitary and hypothalamus. There are a few papers which are saying that even though liver is normal, histology is normal, some of these patients, after spontaneous development of shunts or surgically constructed shunts, are developing features of encephalopathy. So what is the reason? So some EEG changes or neuropsychiatric changes. So people have started working about this portal system inside the cranium, and there is some work which is going on, experimental, but not really very forthcoming. But I'm sure if the system is named portal system, if there is correlation, if we see portopulmonary problem, as you go on managing these cases, some of these cases will come after some time with clubbing, cyanosis, dyspnea. Suddenly they will die unless you do their liver transplant.
so one question from Dr. Rahul Lokhande, Amravati. Dr. Rahul, please unmute your mic. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes. Good evening, sir. I'm Dr. Rahul.
Yeah.
Sir, is there requirement of anticoagulant treatment post-operatively, and for how many days if required then?
Yes, very good question. I had deliberately omitted it that somebody should ask. Okay. Usually, again, there is no fixed pattern of this. What I follow, because of course, my training with a high volume center, and one of the school of thought is that for 8 to 10 days of low dose heparin, that is 100 international units per kg, 8 hourly, either you give through the drip or you give through the subcutaneous route for 10 days and nothing subsequently. There is another school of thought that after these 8 10 days, they put patient on oral anticoagulant for 3 to 6 months. Again, time duration is not there. And third situation is that if simultaneously if you are doing or you are dealing with the prothrombotic condition which has resulted in first place this problem, then you have to take into consideration hematologist's view whether SILA of putting patient on anticoagulation and possibility of bleeding, or Abdica of anticoagulant and worrying for another thrombotic episode. This SILA and Abdica type of a terminology. So there is no clear-cut long-term or protocol about this.
Thank you, sir. Sir, one last question from my side. How is your follow-up protocol for this patient after shunt? Do you regularly check shunt patency with a Doppler, or at time of discharge, do you check the shunt patency and then discharge?
The first thing, I am extremely scared in the post-operative period round, while taking round on third, fourth day, if there is spike of fever. That spike of fever could be because of where our trauma related, surgical and other issues. It could be because you are shifting patient from IV fluids to oral generally by third, fourth day. So some degree of dehydration, which is also known to give fever. If you rule out all these conditions and if there are spikes of fever or few spikes, I am extremely worried about the thrombosis of the shunt. So shunt thrombosis is heralded by a clinical sign of fever, which will occur around that period. And by the end of 8 or 10 days before discharge of the patient, I always do color Doppler assessment if there is patency of the shunt, no across the shunt, is there any formation of thrombus. If at 1 week, if there is nothing, then I call after 1 month and check again. If I am happy there, then subsequently 3 monthly for 1 year, then 6 monthly for 1 year, and then subsequently after along with the endoscopy as and when needed, and location and other issues associated with the patient.
Thank you, sir.
One last comment from my side.
Yes, sir.
Portal hypertension, I don't know about the medical colleges and training of the young surgeons nowadays, and whether they are really exposed to all these kind of surgical procedures in medical colleges. But this is one area which is, I believe, which is lacking. This training in portal hypertension surgery is overall lacking. Most of these patients, our physicians and even our surgeon colleagues, I have found that they refer patient to the gastroenterologist for endoscopy and don't take any interest. And this is something where I suppose our teachers, medical teachers, should take interest and develop this portal hypertension surgical skill and art amongst the budding surgeons.
Very true.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much, Dr. Savji, sir, for that elaborative discussion and a talk on extrahepatic portal vein obstruction. I thank Dr. Tome, sir, and I thank Raj Vilas for being the panelist for this session. So with this, I will close this today's session. We'll meet tomorrow. Tomorrow we have Dr. Roy Patankar, who is coming to us to speak on failed hiatus hernia surgery, or if the patient has come back to you again with some symptoms after hiatus hernia surgery. So we'll all see you tomorrow at 8 p.m. Thank you very much. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you, Yogesh. Thank you,
Thank you.
Raju. Thank you, Yogesh. Thanks.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Yogesh
you.
and Arif.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, man.